Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good podcast from Vote Common Good. It's April 30th. You know, as some people like to say, already, can you believe it? It's almost May, but it's April 30th, and that makes it a Thursday in 2021, which means, it makes it a Friday in 2021, which means we get to talk economics today with Professor Fadhel Kaboub. Professor, you are a professor at Denison University. We were just joking before we came on. When you go to the Denison University website, it says, boy, he's an assistant professor in economics and international studies, philosophy, politics, Mid-East, North African studies. You are the person that knows about all the things that matter. So good to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure.
And most importantly, boy, you have gotten into my head because I am out fixing my driveway, trying to put some new blacktop down to get rid of these breaks in my driveway, and thinking about how the water flows. And then I'm thinking about how water could flow from a lake into a field. And then that makes me think about economics that you've recast in my head as the federal government saying we have a giant lake of money and it's never going to run out. We just want to decide where we're going to put it, and let's move a little money here, let's take a little money away from there. And as I'm laying the tar on my driveway, I'm thinking, boy, I'm like a Federal Reserve, economist out here trying to just move the water off of my roof and down my driveway. So you've been very helpful in helping, I think, all of us here on this podcast to understand how macroeconomics works, if it is macroeconomics, at least the federal government's input in it. And so go ahead and correct me if I got any of that metaphor wrong, because we want to talk about Joe Biden's big spending plans, and coming out not only in the last 100 days, but even just 2 nights ago to say in his address to Congress, hey, we're gonna spend another $1.9 trillion. And so we're excited to talk about that today. Did I get all that right about this metaphor of the federal government's use of money to apply it where it's needed and keep it away from the places it's not?
Yeah, absolutely. You can think of the federal government as, the equivalent of somebody who has access to the largest freshwater lake in their backyard, and they can use it to water their field, to nourish their plants, to drink water for themselves and their family. But you could potentially flood your field with too much water, which will be destructive. But you don't want to starve yourself and dehydrate your plants and ruin your crops, right? So just about right. But living under the illusion that you don't have any water, or that your water is scarce and forces you to kind of dehydrate your field and your family is like the equivalent of shooting yourself in the foot. And that's what many governments live under, the impression that they don't have money and that they need to borrow it from somebody else. And they forget that sovereign governments can issue their own currency under certain rules and regulations and transparency and so on, in order to serve the public purpose. That's really what we're talking about here. And it looks like, the Biden administration is discovering that we could actually safely do that and achieve quite a bit of the public purpose without the risk of inflation, without the risk of bankrupting the country and so on. There are a few talking heads here and there, mostly economists, who are still panicking about the risk of inflation. We can talk about those guys.
All right. So Joe Biden came out and said, we're going to spend this money. Here's my big plan. And this one was the family's plan. Before that, it was the plan for the COVID. Before that, it was after that, I guess it was the infrastructure plan. You put all that together, and it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 trillion, which, when this all came out the other day, I was thinking, when I was a kid, one of my favorite TV shows was The $6 Million Man. And the story of the $6 Million Man was that he was this great government agent that got blown up in a plane crash, but we had the technology to rebuild him. So the storyline was that they made a bionic man with an eye that could see distances, and he could jump, and had all this, sort of bionics, and it was really fun. And I thought, boy, now Joe Biden has become the $6 trillion man. And I was thinking myself, all cute and clever, so we made a little graphic. Then it turns out that old Karl Rove from, Bush days in the early 2000s stole my joke, beat me to it by 3 days, and put out a Washington a Wall Street Journal article, opinion piece saying Joe Biden is the $6 trillion man. Now, he says that in a negative sense. I think it's a really good thing that Joe Biden wants to spend $6 trillion. But here's my question, two questions for you, Fadhel. One is it going to help or hurt our economy? Question number one. Question number two, why does Joe Biden say in the address that he gave to Congress, I want to spend $1.9 trillion and I'm going to tell you how we're going to pay for it? If it's right that the federal government can spend money, why do we, in some spending, say we're going to tell you how we're going to pay for it, and other times not worry about how we're going to pay for it? Or some people want to advocate that how we pay for it is not the most important question, if I've even phrased that right.
Sure. That's a very good question. I mean, what we're seeing with Joe Biden right now with the $6 trillion spending plan is 2 steps forward, and with the how do we pay for it is 1 step back, because
Okay.
that is the false narrative. We know that the government spend money into existence. And spending the $6 trillion is not about finding the money and finding where to tax it and where to borrow it. We know that spending the money is about finding the votes in Congress, because once the votes are there, the spending takes place. The taxing part that Biden and others worry about in the back of their head is the way to pay for it. But even under the most ambitious taxing the rich proposal that you could have on the table today, we're not going to even come close to actually paying for the $6 trillion. It's just not going to happen. And this is really giving ammunition to people who want to kill the spending plan. They say, well, this is clearly not going to pay for it. So this is going to add to the deficit, to the national debt. You're going to bankrupt the country, a burden on future generation. And the whole deficit hawks thing is going to pop up. So I think this is a weakness of the Biden proposal, is that he's not willing to go all the way into what I would call the MMT narrative, which is we can afford the spending. This is an investment in the future of this country, young generation, infrastructure, investing in people, investing in the economy and so on. That's the right narrative. But then saying we need to find the money in some rich person's bank account and tax it, or borrow it from some other financial institution, now you're missing the point. So we're not saying that we shouldn't tax the rich. Absolutely, we should tax the oligarchs. We should tax Wall Street. We should tax polluters. We should tax all the things that we want to tax, not because we need their money or their permission to have a better future, but because we want to reduce their power and influence in politics, their power and influence in the economy, their price-setting behavior, which causes inflation. We want to reduce their carbon footprint because we want to decarbonize the economy. We want to transition to renewable energy, not fossil fuel economy. All of those are important goals for taxation. We want to tax to reduce inequality, which is an important feature. All of those are important, but that's not taxing to pay for the Biden plan. And that's where the narrative sort of breaks down a little bit. And I think the closer we get to a more coherent narrative, not only will we, focus our attention on the things that matter the most, which is the actual investments and the positive effects of this taxation proposal, which is addressing inequality and distribution and pollution and speculation. All of these things are important to tackle. We tackle them with taxation and with aggressive regulation. Right? It's not just taxation. The risk of inflation, which all of us worry about, mainstream economists and MMT economists, the risk of inflation should be the central focus of the debate today. In other words, the $6 trillion that we're spending is going to create a lot of economic activity, and it's going to create a lot of income for individuals who will get those jobs. And now those individuals live in a free country and have the right to spend it whichever way they want. So they're going to buy houses, they're going to buy cars, they're going to buy clothing and entertainment, and you name it, everything they want. Do we have, this is the question now, do we have the productive capacity to meet the new increase in demand that's going to come out of the $6 trillion? In other words, do we have the capacity to build more homes, to build more energy, to produce more consumer goods, so that the increase in demand will be immediately met with new supply. If that's the case, we're not going to see inflation. If we have shortages of skilled people to produce homes, of technical capabilities, machinery, equipment to produce the stuff that people want to buy, then we're going to see inflation. So in order to avoid that risk of inflation, we can decide today, we can scan the economy and identify how much productive capacity we have in every key area of the economy. And if we identify a pocket where we have shortage of skilled people, shortage of capital and machinery and equipment and resources, then we know as soon as we start the $6 trillion spending, we should dedicate part of that spending to building more capacity and skills in that area, because that will mitigate the potential risk of inflation, and it will create jobs in that area and give us better resources and so on. The second, and I'll close with this, the second thing that we need to be thinking about immediately to mitigate the risk of inflation is market power in key sectors of the economy. If we know that additional spending will be abused by key players who will raise their prices simply because they can, because they see more demand for internet services. So internet companies will raise their prices because they're pretty much monopolies now at the local level, right? They don't have any competition. Then we know the source of inflation is going to be health insurance companies. The source of inflation is going to be internet providers. So to mitigate that risk of inflation, we're not going to mitigate it by saying, oh, we shouldn't spend $6 trillion. That's going to cause inflation. But to mitigate it, we need to tax and regulate that market power out of existence. In other words, make those sectors more competitive. Make internet providers more competitive so that they don't abuse their privilege and their power in the economy. So we make them more competitive by enforcing antitrust laws, by investing and supporting companies to enter the market in a competitive way at the local level. And that's how we can safely spend $6 trillion, democratize the market, serve the public purpose without causing inflation.
So I could imagine someone's argument being, hey, if you're going to pump $6 trillion into the economy, and then the government needs to be kind of managing that to make sure that things don't get out of hand, that runs afoul of what we all believe runs the economy, which is a free market, where the market is free from this government interference in deciding which sectors are going to grow and which companies are going to do well. And the freedom side of the argument, those people are always saying two things. We don't want the government interfering. We want free markets. And we don't want redistribution of income. Stop using taxes to take money from some people to put it into some imaginary federal bank account and then to give money to other people. Basically, they want to say like, hey, if you want to give money to other people, just give them money, but don't take it from us. Why that? So can you address that free market argument and why even fuss around, especially with individual income taxes? Like as your thoughts have gotten deeper into my thinking, I'm like, I understand why we want to have taxes on corporations and some industries to be sure that behavior is encouraged. But why do we want to tax me and you and individual income? That feels like, and that's like the one thing that people are comfortable being taxed, and it seems to be by this theory for the federal government at least, like, hey, I'm not chipping into the public dole. That's not how it works. So can you talk a little bit about those two ideas?
Yeah, so I'll start with the freedom idea, with the free market idea. Well, the challenges that we're facing today in our economy and the world are climate change, inequality, structural inequality, and these things cannot be addressed with free market solutions. The abusive market power that we have in the health insurance industry and the internet providers industry, big tech and all of that, that's the result of free market, right? What we're saying is we want to democratize free market so that individual consumers actually have choices and have competitive markets to choose from. Right now, we don't have that, right? So that is impeding on my freedom, on your freedom to choose, because we've abused the use of free market narrative to create these local monopolies and oligopolies and so on. So that's number one. Number two, the government's role in society is to serve the public purpose. And serving the public purpose includes creating infrastructure for us, includes addressing structural weaknesses, providing public services to individuals, especially the most vulnerable individuals who can't afford the price tag offered by the free market. So that is part of the democratic process. And we do it in a democracy by electing a government of the people, by the people, for the people, to serve the public purpose, right? And over the decades, we've lost that democratic feature, and we ended up with the government of the super PACs by the super PACs. So it's a false narrative to say that government intervention in this case is going to impede on the free market. Plus, we're really not talking about the government becoming 50% of the economy. The government right now is right around maybe 15% of the economy. We're talking about the federal government, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about boosting it to 25%. This is not going to kill the free market. People who believe in capitalism and believe in free markets, you have to recognize that free markets are about private property, competition, free and fair competition, freedom of choice, and self-interest. Now, the $6 trillion are not going to take away your private property. They're not going to take away your freedom of choice. If anything, we're trying to enhance freedom of choice. They're definitely not going to get into your DNA and get rid of your self-interest, kind of self-motivation. And we're not taking away your private property or competition or freedom of choice. All of these things will be enhanced with additional choices in a more democratic, more competitive market. So if anything, this is 100% within the purviews of capitalism and markets. It's going to be a slightly different kind of capitalism that's less abusive, less extractive, less exclusive of the most vulnerable people. And it happens to be the kind of capitalism that will help us mitigate some of the negative side effects of too much reliance on free markets in the oil and gas industry, and nudge new markets, new competitive markets in the renewable energy industry, which will be thriving private sector markets that happen to produce a positive side effects in terms of jobs and clean air and clean water and all of that. So that's how I would frame it. Of course, some people are not going to like it because they say, "Oh, you're taxing me to pay for that," and that's the other part of the narrative that I wish the Biden administration and others would get straight, which is no, we're not taxing you to pay for this thing. We're taxing you not because we're going to redistribute. We're taxing because we're going to pre-distribute moving forward. So pre-distribution, meaning you spend money in the right.
Pre-distribution versus redistribution. That feels like a key element to the way that you understand the federal government economics. Pre-distribution, not redistribution. All right, I'm just going to let that ring around in my head.
Think about it this way: the federal government, as the sovereign issuer of the dollar, has the power and the privilege to actually spend money into existence, like those $6 trillion, for example. Now, we can spend them the right way, and we can spend them the wrong way. So this is what we're talking about, pre-distribution. So you want to spend in a way that distributes that new wealth evenly in the most neglected areas of the economy, in the most neglected pockets of society. And we want to spend that money in a way that produces clean air, clean water, shared prosperity for everybody, as opposed to the old way of spending, which spending in a way that automatically produces pollution and exclusion and inequality, spending towards the top, right? So we as a democratic society can decide how we're going to spend this and what the effects of the spending is going to be. So we can have a small group of people decide to spend it in the traditional way with money siphoned to the top, or we can spend the money in a way that is strategically designed from the beginning to produce less pollution, less, asthma conditions because of pollution, and less inequality, and spend in the areas of the economy that has been neglected by the market, neglected by the state, by the city, and by the federal government for decades. And we're talking about the poorest parts of the country, parts of every state, every community. You know which part of your community that is, right? It's people of color, it's immigrants, it's the poorest areas of your city, of your state. Those are areas that have been neglected by the free market because the free market has no incentive to invest in a poor community, right? If anything, it has every incentive to extract wealth from the most vulnerable.
What caused the two big times when inflation was a problem that I know of sort of popularly in our society were the 1930s, what we call the Depression, and the 1970s, the hyperinflation that took off, especially around oil prices and some food and so on.
Yeah, let me stop you right there with one quick correction.
Please,
the 1930s, the 1930s was not a period of inflation. It was a period of deep deflation. That was the big problem of the 1930s. You're thinking of Germany, right?
Well, I don't know what I'm thinking. I'm just thinking when, the economy crashed.
The economy crashed, but there was no inflation during the Great Depression.
Okay.
Prices were actually falling. Yeah. I'm happy to talk about inflation.
Well, yeah, let's do. But just correct me again. Have we only had one period in modern, last 150 years of the United States economy when we've had an inflation spike? Like all the worry about inflation, which comes up, and people don't even know how to think about that. When they say, well, if Biden spends all this money, it's going to cause inflation to go up, and the Fed's worried about inflation. I mean, I hear it all the time because I listen to NPR, so they're always saying this. They never explain how the system works, how this would happen. Have we only had one period where we would say the overall economy was impacted by inflation, and that being
in the last 100 years? Yeah, that would be the main inflation cycle, is the 1970s. And
why are we worried about that when it's happened one? I mean.
Well, wait until you learn how it happened. Wait until you learn how it happened, and then you'll worry even less about inflation.
Recast the 1970s for me. Yeah.
So the 1970s inflation came after a long period of big government spending, welfare spending, the big golden age of post-war economic growth. And during that post-war growth period, all the inflationistas of the time were yelling and screaming, big government, big deficits, too much interference in free markets. This is going to cause a collapse. This is going to cause hyperinflation and so on. And sure enough, the 1970s happened, and I'll tell you why it happened. And they came back screaming and said, we told you so. The system is going to break down, so now you need to listen to us. The problem is none of their arguments about what causes inflation was actually valid in the 1970s. But it didn't matter because that was their political moment. Milton Friedman famously said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And he was the key player in that transition. So it doesn't matter what the cause is, we're going to use it as a justification to bring back free markets and kind of neoliberal economics. But what did cause the 1970s inflation? Not just in the US, this was a global phenomenon. It was the oil crisis in the Middle East. And I grew up in the Middle East, so I can tell you more about what happened. But essentially, what happened was a political conflict between Arabs and Israelis, which we don't have to go into. In that conflict, the Soviet Union at the time was mostly leaning with the Syrian and Egyptian governments in that conflict, supporting the Arabs on that side. And the United States and Western Europe was supporting Israel, right? And we can debate the merits of that conflict. But the point is, the Arab states recognize that they have an economic weapon that they can use to tilt the balance of power between, the U.S. support to Israel and their side. And they say, here's what we can do. The Western world, the United States and Western Europe, who support the Israelis in that conflict, they can't function without oil because you use oil for energy production, shipping, transportation, petrochemicals. Everything you have around you in that room, everything I have on my desk right here is made out of plastics and petrochemicals and paint and all kinds of things. So they said, here's what we can do. We control the majority of the global supply of oil. We can artificially turn off the tap and slow down our production and let the market mechanism kick in. The demand for oil is up here. Now the supply for oil is dropping because we turned off the tap. So what's going to happen to the price? It literally quadrupled overnight, which means the cost of everything that uses energy, electricity, shipping, petrochemicals is increasing. So the price of everything across the globe increased, and that was inflation. That's what inflation is when the average price level goes up. So the root cause of the inflation was literally a political conflict in the Middle East, a diplomatic military conflict in the Middle East. And that was the creation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. That's what OPEC is. So they said, let's do this and cause some economic pain to the US and Western Europe to bring them to the negotiation table to figure out a solution to this conflict. The thing is, Milton Friedman and von Hayek and all the free market neoliberals who were yelling and screaming since the 1950s saying big government, big deficits is going to bankrupt the country, they seized that opportunity. They said, aha, we told you so, that big government spending and labor unions and all of that is going to break the system. But of course, it had nothing to do with it. But their political narrative made perfect sense because the public was, in pain. Working people were in pain in the US. Millions of people couldn't afford literally to fill up gas to go to work. And we had a major recession because of that in the US and Europe. That 1970 cycle was the rise of Reagan and Thatcher because they came in armed with the free market narrative and saying, we told you that big government spending of the last 20 years is going to break the system. We need to bring free markets back. And that's kind of what led to Reagan and Thatcher being elected to destroy unions, destroy the welfare state, and so on. But if the root cause was oil prices and a conflict in the Middle East, the end of that inflation cycle was literally due to the end of the political conflict. It had nothing to do with free markets, with killing labor unions, with killing the welfare state and all that. But that's only, the narrative that narrative you almost never hear in the media. You hear that Reagan and Thatcher killed inflation and the Fed ended inflation and any big government is going to bring us back to the days of the 1970s. I'll tell you one more thing, which I think your listeners will find intriguing here, which is during that inflation cycle, Jimmy Carter started the first solution to that inflation problem, which is the following. They immediately recognized that we have an energy crisis here, right? We can't import this expensive stuff to fuel our economy. The question became, do we have any other source? And some people said, oh yeah, we could, put solar panels to heat water, for example. And there was a solar panel on top of the White House in the Jimmy Carter administration, which Reagan immediately took down, by the way. So that was the first thought about alternative sources of energy. But the biggest thing wasn't the solar panels on the White House, because those were very inefficient at the time and so on. But the big boost to the US economy that's really put a damper on inflation was deregulating the natural gas industry. And that was the birth of fracking. You can thank Jimmy Carter for that. You can thank the oil crisis of the 1970s, because we have natural gas here in the US, as we obviously know now. And that's an alternative source of energy to fuel electricity generation, at least for industrial production, for heating homes and so on. And that substantially reduced the amount of energy we had to import. So those are the root causes of inflation, and the root solutions are either finding an alternative substitute to the source of energy you buy from the global economy, or solve the actual political conflict, sign a peace treaty in the Middle East, and the whole thing will disappear. And that's exactly what happened. Once the peace treaty was signed, the OPEC countries, the Arab countries, had no incentive to cause economic pain to the US or Western Europe, and oil prices dropped to their lowest level by 1980s. And that was the end of the source of inflation. It had nothing to do with Milton Friedman, had nothing to do with free markets, had nothing to do with labor unions or none of that. But the political narrative was all focused on, let's bring the free market back to end the source of inflation. So literally, this illusion we have in the back of our minds that big government spending, welfare spending is going to cause inflation has no validity in the real world whatsoever. And the reference back to the 1970s by people like Larry Summers and all that just confirms to you that they know nothing about what they're saying, or they're literally trying to mislead people. either
Well,
one or the
that
other,
was
and
going to
both
be
are
my
bad.
question to you. Was in the Reagan age, in the in our current period, what Biden said the other night about we're going to find a way to pay for it, and here's how we're going to do it, and laid out the payment plans.
Yeah.
Is this because people don't know or understand or aren't sure, or third, they're just using that language to accomplish another goal, knowing full well that's not how it goes. Like when I listen to a Ted Cruz or a Josh Hawley or some of the insurrectionist leading senators, like do they just not know this, or do they say, look, we're never going to take a crisis that we're never going to let a crisis pass that we can't use for our free market purposes?
That's a
Like,
very
do they
good
really
question.
worry that that's going to hurt the economy? Did they really believe that their tax cuts in 2017 were going to fuel the economy? That's how it works, or what? And I know this is a bit of speculation.
I think
like
it's
this.
so I'm not privy to every member of Congress and Senate and White House in terms of what their motivations are and what they know and what they don't know. I can tell you overall, some of them do know the MMT narrative, but they're convinced that it's not dominant and accepted enough. So they try to be practical in trying to get the right number of votes to pass this bill, for example. And I'm hoping that this is the case with the Biden administration, that they actually understand how it works, but they kind of feel like they're dealing with children who still believe in fairy, the tooth fairy.
Yeah.
So they Santa Claus and the tooth fairy. So they try to convince them using those narratives, saying, well, you kind of have to do this because the tooth fairy will come at night and give you a couple of dollars and will give you candy or whatever. So, work with them based on what they believe in their heads and try to get them to work with you. I'm hoping that is the case. But I'm an intellectual, I'm an academic, and I believe in transparency and open discourse with the public. So I'm not going to tell adults about fairy tales and tooth fairies. I'm going to tell them this is how the system works. And it's really a technical explanation. This is not about a political ideology of this versus that. We can debate political ideologies transparently. This is what I believe in. This is what you believe in. I can believe in climate change. You may not believe in climate change. We can debate that on the technical merits of climate change. But don't tell me we can't address climate change because we don't have money. Don't tell me we can't address poverty and inequality because we don't have money.
Because we can't afford it.
My interest in these debates is to demonstrate that we do have the money and that we can do it without compromising with democracy or capitalism or freedom of choice or any of that. If anything, we can enhance all of these things without bankrupting the country, without causing inflation.
And you've used the referenced MMT, modern monetary theory, which is the larger category, for better or worse, in its I guess in its marketing prowess. But that's the phrase that kind of explains this way of thinking about monetary theory in a current fashion, and that's what you're describing. And it's become clear to me that this is how people understand the economy in the Senate and in the White House, because they refer to it around some issues, right? Sometimes they hint and wink that they know there's no tooth fairy and that it doesn't work like this. It also dawned on me because of a comment I heard the other day from someone, that when we pay our money to the IRS, so every year, some reason, I can't figure out how to not pay my money to the IRS. So I write a check to the Internal Revenue Service. That money doesn't go into a bank account that then later the federal government writes a check to, to Boeing to build a fighter jet. It's not like my own bank account where if someone writes me a check, I put it in and then the bank holds onto it for me and then I pay it out. There is no federal government bank account. Can you just help us understand, when we pay our money to the IRS and they cash that check, where does that money go?
Very good question. So there's a difference between you paying taxes to your state and local municipality. That money they cash, and that's what they use to spend to build the roads and to fix the potholes and so on. The money you pay to the federal government is money that's literally shredded, destroyed.
This one blows
Because
my
the
mind.
government doesn't need it to spend. The government creates its own money into existence. The government doesn't need to wait for your tax revenues. Say, oh, now we can afford the war because you pay taxes. Well, war decisions, spending decisions are made completely independently of how much money is going to come in tax revenues. I mean, that's how we entered World War II. Can you imagine if we went from the Great Depression, the most miserable economic time, to World War II, the most expensive government program, waiting for tax revenues to come in, or waiting for us to be able to borrow from wealthy people or for whatever? There was no money to be borrowed, no money to be taxed during the Great Depression. So World War II was fully funded when we voted to approve the spending and voted to enter the war. And we didn't vote to go to World War II by saying, oh, we're going to send them 10,000 troops every 2 months and see if we can win this thing. Of course, you can't win a war like that. You have to spend on a massive scale to win that thing. Same thing with fighting poverty, with fighting inequality, with fighting climate change. We're not going to win it by saying, oh, we're going to dedicate, $10 billion this year to do this and see, maybe we'll end climate change like that. It's just not going to work. It's going to have to be on this larger scale because we've waited for so long to address these things, to transform the economy, to invest in young people and in the most neglected areas of the economy. So the fact that we're talking about $6 trillion and to me, really, if you ask me, 6 trillion is just the beginning. I mean, there's much more to come.
That's the
I
fear,
hope.
I think, for a lot of people that's just the beginning,
sure,
right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
that's their fear.
But I'll tell you where those fears of inflation come from. They come from an old system that no longer exists, which is the old monetary system in which we had gold reserves to back the U.S. dollar, and this dates back to centuries, really, because it's not like the U.S. invented gold. Back in the old days, the king used to mint coins of gold and silver, precious metals, and the quantity of gold embedded in the actual coin give it its value. So it had an intrinsic value. So if the king was going to war and needed to spend more money and literally didn't have physical quantity of gold, you have a problem. So what kings used to do is they used to cheat. They mint coins with smaller quantities of gold in them, and as a result, they devalue the coin. But of course, merchants are not stupid. They immediately notice that the weight of the coins is lighter, and you've probably seen in the old Western movies when people bite on the gold coins, because gold is soft. If it breaks your teeth, then you know it's fake. But if it's soft, you know it's got gold in it, right? So this is where it comes from. The merchants notice that the king is cheating. The king is spending too much and devaluing the coins. So what do I do as a merchant? If I was selling this dress for 10 coins, now I'm going to sell it for 15 because I actually want more gold for the product that I'm selling. So
and there's less gold in each
additional
coin, so you need
government
more coins.
spending, that irresponsible government spending by the king is causing inflation. That was the case back in the gold standard days. Absolutely correct, because you're physically tied to a quantity of gold. And that's why kings and queens invaded other countries to get their gold.
And
to mine more gold.
When did we detach our U.S. dollar from gold? I know there was something official that
1971.
Nixon did 71. But even before that, we had sort of moved somehow because we could spend money in the 1930s and 40s without it being gold. So that transition had taken a while, or
no, that transition took a while to stick. Almost all countries that had a gold standard always hit the pause button on the gold standard and get off of it during wars, because they know that they can't spend if they have a gold standard during a war.
I see.
So they hit the pause button, and then after the war, they go back to sound behavior and they go back to the gold peg. In the US in 1971, because at the time the US dollar became the currency reserve, the global reserve currency for the entire world. After World War II, there was an agreement to not have all countries hold their gold reserves, but have countries now hold the US dollar as their currency reserve. And then the US committed to the rest of the world that every dollar that anybody in the world has, they could actually redeem it for a fixed quantity of gold at the US Treasury. But by 1971, there is clearly not enough gold in the world to back up the quantity of paper money in the system. So that's when we decided we're transitioning to what we call fiat money, which means it's unbacked currency. Fiat meaning by decree. Whatever the government says, it says this is a $10 bill, it means it's a $10 bill. It's not, it doesn't have any gold embedded in it or backed by it. It's just a worthless piece of paper with a little bit of cotton and security threads in it. It's worth nothing in and of itself, but it's worth $10 because the government says so. It's worth $100 because the government says so. And if you don't like it, bring it back, we'll give you change. That's what it's worth, right? But it's not, there's no intrinsic value.
So no longer after 1971, we really fully made the transition to say now the US dollar is backed by the full promise of the federal government that it's going to be fulfilled. That really completed this movement away from a limited amount of currency.
Right.
And so now we're in a period where the government uses all kinds of ways to keep track of how much money's in the economy. And I used to hear this phrase in 2008, quantitative easing, which I think was just saying we're going to put more dollars in the economy so that the quantity is not so high, and there'll be more around, and we're never going to run out of money. You know, the Federal Reserve in 2008 had to come out and tell everyone, no, this financial crisis caused by fraud and all the rest of whatever caused that to happen in 2007 and 2008. There's enough money. Never worry that we're going to run out. We're not going to ever run out of money. That hit people as a bit of a shock that that's possible.
Sure.
And I think
there
still
was
haven't.
This one clip. There's this one interview with Ben Bernanke, the chair of the Fed at the time, on 60 Minutes, where, you know, if you remember at the time, Congress was debating the TARP money, the bailouts, the $700 or $800 billion. And at the same time, the Fed was just going full speed with quantitative easing, trillions of dollars. So in that 60-minute interview, they asked Ben Bernanke, so we're here sitting debating whether we should spend $700 or $800 billion and whether we have the money and taxpayers' money and all that. And you, in the meantime, without any approval from Congress or the president, are injecting trillions of dollars. Where is that money coming from? Is that taxpayers' money? And where did you? And he was like, no, this is not taxpayers' money. We at the Fed have a computer, we have a keyboard, and we have keystrokes. We just add a bunch of zeros, and the numbers get bigger. And that's how we credit, you know, a bank account, and we can create money into existence. And everybody was like, what? We have this. We're debating pennies over here to save the economy and to save millions of people from foreclosures. In the meantime, you have this massive firepower that you're injecting in the financial system. And that's when everybody turned around and said, well, wait a minute, which economists have been saying this for a while? It's the MMT economists. They said the government has the spending capacity.
So Eva in the comments makes a comment that I think is just worth tapping into one more last time, because it's the way so many people think. And we've all been taught to say this. She says, we could pay for all and more by reducing military spending and making the uber rich pay their fair share. That phrase, make the uber rich pay their fair share, cut it from somewhere else. There's enough money. It's in their bank accounts, not ours. Now, Eva, like me, believed for a long time that, oh, no, that's how it works. There is enough money. We just need to get it out of that place and get it over to this place. And what you're saying is, no, there's enough money, regardless of where else money is. We may have reasons that we want to reduce military spending and tax the rich, but it's not to get the federal government, again, not the state or local or county government, but the federal government, enough money. When we've all worked so hard just to finally get to the point, from Bernie Sanders to Joe Biden and Eva, to be able to say, make the rich pay their fair share and we'll have enough money. That has taken so long to get there that now to say, like, hey, don't worry about the super rich, we have enough money anyway, feels like it takes all the moral outcry out of a system that's economically unfair. So can you just say a little bit about those thoughts?
Yeah, Ava's comment about making the rich pay their fair share Absolutely. But saying that without them paying their fair share, we can't have healthcare, we can't have education, that's the false narrative. By saying we need to reduce military spending for peace and stability purposes because it's consuming too much, causing too much conflict around the world, whatever, I can be with you there, right? But saying that without reducing military budget, we will not have money to pay for school lunches, that's a false narrative. Because once we decouple those things, we realize how much potential we have. And I joked, I think, last month on this show, and I emphasized this is really a joke. And I love Canada and my Canadian friends. I always say, if we wanted to have better healthcare, education, infrastructure, invest in families and all that, and invade Canada at the same time, I guarantee you we can do it. We can afford it. But doesn't mean we should.
So here's my new analogy on this. When my kids became young adults and we would go out to dinner with them, I had enough money in my bank account to pay for dinner for the 2, 3, or 4, 5 of us, whatever. I could pay for it all. Right. But there was a moment where they wanted to, or I wanted them to chip in. Sure. Like, hey, chip in on this. This would be a fair deal. Not because without them chipping in, I couldn't afford it. Like, we didn't have such an expensive meal that, boy, I'm running a little short. Now I need you to chip in. There was something else about the relationship of our family, them approaching adulthood. I remember when my son said, Dad, I'm going to pick up the tab. Felt good. That was all about how we live together, not about the money. And getting to the understanding that taxes is different. There's this old song from the 1970s, since I'm doing nostalgia here today, apparently, by a group called 10 Years After. And it's called I Want to Change the World. And there's this lyric in it that I won't sing it for you. We can't play it because they'll not allow us to show this on social media if we play songs for some reason. But the line goes, tax the rich, feed the poor, until there are no rich no more. And this idea that we do want to tax the rich for all kinds of reasons, we do want to feed the poor, but what's the purpose of that? And there are a lot of people whose argument is because rich people are bad and we want them to go away. That's this song's argument. And other people because they say, hey, look, you're benefiting so much from the economy that all the rest of us are putting in on. It's just unfair that you have so much that you have nothing to do with. It's just being heaped on you. And we think that that's not fair. But not to say that there won't be rich people is some people's argument. Joe Biden in the address the other night said, I disagree with some of my fellow Democrats. I think it's okay to be a millionaire or a billionaire. I'm not trying to not have billionaires. Still like having this argument from this, it was reflected in this song. So I think there's a lot of people who need to have an alternative to why do we want to tax the rich? Why do we want Amazon to pay corporate taxes and not dodge them? Now, I don't know if that's the way it should go, but if you have a comment about that, and then Peggy Hay says, which I think is also important, we only have a couple minutes left here, but she says, hey, why don't we pay all the debt that we owe to other countries if we have all this money? And you've really helped me to understand what debt is at the federal, what federal deficit and federal debt is. It doesn't mean that we owe a mortgage like I do on my house or like a business might on a line of credit. It's totally opposite. We shouldn't even call it debt. So any comments on taxing the rich so we don't have them anymore, and then anything about this debt business?
So taxing the billionaires and the ultra billionaires, which, by the way, I mean, if we use this phrase all the time, we're talking about billionaires as if it's a normal thing. Like, do you know what a billion is? Do you know what multiple billions, adds up to? We're talking about lots and lots of money beyond anything that any human being could possibly consume for an individual, for a family, for a corporation. Right. It's just obscene, right? It's extreme amount of wealth that's beyond anything that any of us can picture. So that's just wrong. And you hear many of us on the left often say that every billionaire is a public policy failure. It's a failure of public policy to produce adequate, quality of life results, because the way you acquire billions and billions of dollars in one way or another is extractive of the resources that we as a society have established, have created. And those resources include public health, include the infrastructure, the roads, the airports, the people that you hire to do the work for you, their education, their health, the resources they have, the public services they benefited from when they were children and their parents. All of that has been kind of brought to you by your public institutions, by public investment. So by extracting wealth from things that have been created by the public, including technology, by the way, lots of technological innovations has been funded by grants of scientific research and development at public universities. And then the technology is privatized via venture capital. Because a lot of the science and technology development that takes place at the early stage of development is not profitable, because you're just developing the science behind it. But once you get like 2 inches close to actually producing the technology that will actually be used by the market and by the public, that's where venture capitalists jump in and say, we'll give you the $25 million to get you to market. But how about the billions of dollars of research and development and scientific contributions by many, many people in the academic world and the scientific world who have been public employees funded by public education to get us to the point where markets can actually create the technology that will make billions of dollars. That's what we're talking about here. So paying your fair share is making sure that you're not extracting obscene amounts of wealth from public services and public institutions that have allowed you to get there. So that's number one.
And again, not because if you have it, then the government doesn't have it, but to say the government decides or the economy decides it's going to spend $1 trillion. And if you have $1 billion, you weren't supposed to get that much. You were supposed to, that some of that was supposed to go somewhere else. So in other words, this pooling idea, we had this big lake and you want to put some in your yard. Some of it's just sitting over in this little dip. And we realized, hey, all that water shouldn't be over there. Some of that water was meant to go over here. But that's not the same thing as saying, well, we don't have enough in the ever producing lake of water. That's a really different argument for people to make, because it's fairness and morality at a level that's not just about then we don't have this other thing. And I think we need to develop an ethic that explains kind of why it's unfair. Now, I do think some businesses some businesses are not just like they're getting more than they should. They're like the person at the baseball game. I don't know how they're going to do this. When the beer vendor comes down the aisle, and the beer vendor says this person's 6 seats in, and they want to hand the beer down and they can't reach. So they hand it to each person who passes it along. Like that's what the economy is. And you could think each person is like, this thing that's coming along is this public good. And you're like that guy in the 3rd seat who's, while handing it to the person in the 6th seat, just takes a couple drinks, right? And sometimes some of these businesses are like, hey, I know this is for the public good, but I'm just going to grab a little right now. I'm never going to pay for a beer. I'm just going to drink it as it's being passed along, right? That's a kind of unfairness that I think some of us see in the economy. And we hear billionaires say like, hey, I worked really hard for my $1 billion. Like, no, that's not how you're benefiting about things you had literally nothing to do with. But that's a different, I don't know. So I feel like we don't have in our society a moral argument for the 1,000 people or families that kind of got overly benefited by the economy. We don't know how to talk about that in a way that's good. So anyway, sorry for the sermon and commentary there, but
no,
it
makes perfect sense.
Idea.
And for a lot of people who say, well, why are you going after business people, the rich and all that? And this is for my friends who are actually business people. I always have to remind them, you do realize that your business and their business, we're not talking about the same universe. We're not talking about the same amount of hard work that you put into it or the same amount of wealth that's extracted. It's not like we're saying we don't want business people to be rich. We want them to be rich. We want them to be even millionaires, multimillionaires. But once you go into the multi-billion-dollar wealth accumulation, we're talking about a completely different league in terms of political influence and in terms of economic influence. And none of those are consistent or coherent with democracy. So that becomes... that becomes...
Do you have 1 minute on debt, on what it means for the government to be in debt? And we're an indebted country and we owe all this money to other countries, this storyline?
Sure. So the thing that we call the U.S. national debt is literally the sum total of all the government spending that happened year after year, minus the tax revenues that were collected in those years. So annually, we have something called the budget deficit. So the government spends 100 and taxes 80, for example. So we have a deficit of 20. So deficit after deficit after deficit, it adds up to the national debt. And then literally the national debt is the equivalent of those government bonds that the U.S. Treasury sells, that many of us have, financial institutions, banks, but also foreign governments, foreign central banks accumulate part of their wealth by investing in U.S. government bonds. Those government bonds are literally a piece of paper, or a digital form of it these days, that says, we, the federal government, we, the U.S. Treasury, promise to pay you back plus interest in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever the duration of that bond, the maturity of it is. And when those payments come due, the U.S. federal government has no constraint in terms of it being able to honor its commitment and pay for the principal and interest, because we are literally the issuer of our own currency. We don't have to have gold or silver or go borrow US dollars from some other country, right? So it's not the same as my debt to the bank. I really have to work hard for it and actually earn money to pay for it. But what we call the US national debt is a misnomer, because it literally represents the sum total of all the savings that the rest of us in the non-government sector have. Because it's literally me opening a savings account at the bank versus opening a savings account at the US Treasury. Because that's the agreement that says, I'm giving you this money, I'm depositing it here in this account called US Treasury bond, and you, the US Treasury, promise to pay me back plus interest. So, because...
And why does the US Treasury need our money? Why are they selling bonds and saying, I'll pay you back more later for a little bit of your money now? It creates the impression in people's mind that, hey, right, I need your money now. I need your dollar so badly. I'll give you $1.20 in 3 years. Why does the U.S. is that a hold? Are U.S. bonds basically a holdover from a previous economic system, or what? Why are we still doing that?
The best example I can give you to illustrate is how we paid for World War II. We paid for World War II by spending money into existence. People had lots of cash available that they could use to buy cars and homes and whatever. But during the war, we didn't have any capacity to produce new cars or new homes or anything. So we were facing a massive risk of inflation. One of the solutions that we used to, mitigate that risk of inflation is by convincing all those people not to spend during the war, to save during the war, and then spend after the war, when we actually have soldiers back from the war to build homes, to build cars, and so on. So we sold them freedom bonds, government bonds, literally. Let's say, give me $10,000. I promise to pay you back $10,000 plus interest after the war. And that's how we convince the public to abstain from consumption, to help us eliminate the risk of inflation. So the government didn't need that money to pay for the war. The war is already paid for, but it needed people to abstain from consumption. That's one aspect. We do it now for two reasons. One is, to some extent, managing the risk of inflation, but it's not really the main goal. And at this stage, it's really stabilizing interest rates, because the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank, you talked earlier about quantitative easing. The Fed buys and sells government bonds on a daily basis. So when the Fed sells government bonds to some of us in the private sector, it's literally taking cash out of circulation, right? Because it's giving me bonds, it's taking cash out of circulation. So it's reducing the quantity of money. And when the Fed is selling bonds to somebody in the market, it's buying and selling bonds, puts money in, takes money out. But the key thing is that it allows the central bank, the Fed, to stabilize interest rates in the bond market.
Okay.
And when you stabilize interest rates, you stabilize the entire financial system. So it's a
So would
policy
this be
tool.
fair to say, like when the government takes money out, it's not the economy. It's not like me taking money from my wallet and putting in my bank account. When they take it out, they shred it. It disappears. When they repay it, they put some back in. So what they're doing with bonds or with what's referred to as debt, and I think it's a terrible phrase if this is true,
Right.
they're taking money out so that there's less money in the economy, or they're paying interest, so they're putting more money back in. And this is a little lever that they use to sort of
Exactly.
scoop some water out and hose a little water in, and that's what's going on. So to call it debt, or to say Congress has to meet and the Senate has to raise the debt ceiling, what that means is, we're going to continue to put money in the economy. We're going to keep the hose on versus scooping some water out. That's such a different way to think about it. Why do we keep calling it debt? Why do we say, why is there a little ticker in New York City that says the national debt? And why does everybody, including Democrats I know, want us to get to a balanced budget where it's zero? What we take in revenue and what we put out in expenditures is the same. And boy, that would feel great, like it was, during the time when Bill Clinton was president.
That's really the myth. That's the myth that we're trying to bust, that the federal government is not like you and I. It's not like your local state budget that needs to be balanced. The federal government is the net issuer of the currency for the system. And there was a time, there were 6 times in U.S. history where the U.S. government literally tried to pay off the national debt. No joke, no BS. I mean, most of people talk about paying off the national debt. It's really just talk. They know that it can't be done. 6 times, every single time we tried to literally pay off the national debt, we caused a Great Depression. Not a recession, a Great Depression, because we're literally taking so much money out of circulation that we're drying the system of liquidity, of economic juice. And the last time we attempted that was 1929, which immediately led to the Great Depression, the last Great Depression we had. So we've learned our lesson since then. The federal government should not pay off the national debt, because it shouldn't be called debt, as you said, because you're literally sucking money out of circulation and starving the system of the juice that makes the economy function. We can't do that. You and I should pay our debts. Yeah. Corporations should pay their debts. States and municipalities should pay, because we're users of the dollar. The federal government is the only issuer of the dollar, so it has no constraint. So it needs to give us, the rest of us, enough dollars to accumulate wealth, to accumulate surplus, to conduct economic activity. And if it sucks it out of the system, then it's literally destroying the economy.
Yeah, and this is so important, because the person I live with, my wife, she said the other day, I love what Biden's talking about, but boy, it seems like he's spending a lot of money. And then trying to, say like, yeah, but that's what the government does. Yeah, but then we're not going to have enough for the other thing. Like, that story is so embedded. So if you've enjoyed this podcast, friends, share it around with your friends. We will continue to share this and try to chop it up into smaller bits. Fadhel, again, it's been so helpful. Thank you for being rudimentary with me and with us each time, but it's starting to really get through. And I really hope that we have a conversation in this country that is about the common good. And basically it's just like explaining things as they actually are. Like, this is how it really does work. So thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for listening to us. Happy Friday, and we will see you all on Monday.
Take care.